Okay, we are factoring algebraic expressions. Ready to go?
Yep.
Okay, so before we actually get to factoring, let's do a little bit of review about multiplying polynomials. So let's go ahead and look at an example. So here we have the quantity x minus 4 times the quantity x plus 2. These are two polynomials. X minus 4 is a binomial because it has two terms, and x plus 2 is a binomial. And you probably remember that you have to multiply each of the terms out here by each of the terms over here. And people sometimes memorize that by writing arrows and thinking about the term FOIL. So you can think about the first ones, then the outer ones, then the inner ones, and then the last ones, and that's FOIL for first, outer, inner, last. Or you can just remember that you need to multiply each one of the things in the first binomial by each one in the second binomial, whichever is easiest for you. And once you practice a lot, you'll get really used to that. So let's go ahead and write out what each one of these things are. So that first one, what would we write there, Jordan?
It would be x times x.
Good. Okay, and then how about the second term, this second arrow here, the outer?
X times 2.
X times 2, good. Now, how about the inner? And make sure you're paying attention to that sign there for the 4.
Negative 4 times x.
Good. And then how about the last one?
It would be x times, or negative 4 times 2.
Very good. Okay, now let's go ahead and multiply those out. So what would we write for the first term?
X squared.
Good. And then what?
2x.
Plus 2x, yeah. And then?
Minus 4x.
Good. And then?
Minus 8.
Okay, good. So you're just multiplying the terms. And then remember, we usually have to do a little bit of simplification because we have some like terms here. So now what should I write?
You would write negative 2x.
Negative 2x for that middle one. So let's write the whole thing out. So what would I write first?
X squared.
Good.
Minus 2x.
Good.
Minus 8.
Minus 8. Good. So you took two binomials here because they each have two terms, and you came up with a trinomial here. So that's how we multiply. Now, here we're talking about factoring, and factoring is really just the opposite of multiplication. So it's going the other direction. So what we're going to do is we're going to take something like this, and we're going to try to move the other direction to end up with something like this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of things about this example that we just did here. Okay, the first thing is that this third term here, the negative 8, it must be the product of what up here?
The product of the last two terms.
The last two terms, okay? So we'll go ahead and write that. The numbers in the parentheses instead of the variables. So in other words, negative 8 is the product of negative 4 and 2. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one thing that you can keep in mind as you're looking to factor. The other thing is that the second term, so the negative 2x, must be the sum of what?
Of the numbers.
Yep, the exact same thing, right? So of the numbers in parentheses. So that negative 2 must be the sum of the negative 4 and the 2. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So when you're given something like this and you're asked to factor, it's kind of a puzzle. You're looking for numbers up here that are both, when you multiply them, their product is going to equal this third term, and when you add them, their sum is going to equal the second term. So that's really what you're looking for, is to solve that puzzle. So let's go ahead and try an example over here by factoring. So here we have x squared minus 2x minus 8. This should look a little similar to something over here. Okay, so we're really just going the opposite direction with an example we just did. But how would we figure that out? Let's go through some steps here. So what we're trying to get to is something that's where we're filling in these two question marks here. And you can kind of see it because negative 8 is a negative number. So it can't be a positive times a positive because that would be positive, right?
Right.
And it can't be a negative times a negative because that would be what?
A positive.
A positive also. So it has to be a negative times a positive. So we can write in the operators here, the minus and the plus. And that is a little bit helpful, but we still don't know what goes in place of those question marks. So what we need to do is we need to start looking for factors of this negative 8 that two numbers that multiply to get to negative 8 and add to get to negative 2. And one way to do that is to make a table. So let's go ahead and set up a table. And I've put the first example for you here because one way to multiply to get to negative 8 is just to take negative 8 times 1, right?
Yeah.
But if you add those, you get negative 7. And we want something that adds up to get to negative 2. So that's not going to be our solution. We'll put a little red X there. So another way to get to negative 8 would be, I'll just go ahead and start it here, 8 times negative 1. Right? Mm-hmm. But what do those add up to?
7.
7, right? So that's not going to be our answer either. Okay, now another way to get to negative 8 would be to have 4 times what would equal negative?
Negative 2.
Negative 2, right? But when you add those, what do you get?
2.
2, right? And that's close. That's really close, but we want negative 2. So is that our solution?
No.
Okay, so what's the only other possibility here?
Negative 4 and positive 2.
Negative 4 and positive 2, and that adds up to become?
Negative 2.
Negative 2, exactly right. So here we found our solution. So now we can look up here and we can fill in those blanks. That negative 2 is going to go here. I'm sorry, the negative 4 is going to go here, and the positive 2 is going to go here, so we can go ahead and write that. So negative 4 and positive 2. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, now, this was a big chore to build this whole table. And once you get some more practice, you'll probably be able to see some of these without writing out the whole table. So let's try to do that with one here, or with a couple. Okay, so here we have x squared plus 5x plus 6. So remember, we're going to need two numbers that multiply to be 6 and also do what?
Add to 5.
Add to 5, okay? And is it going to be an x plus and an x plus, or an x plus and an x minus, or an x minus and an x minus up here? What's it going to be?
An x plus and an x plus.
Right. And how do you know that?
Because it's positive 5 and positive 6.
Right. So we need two numbers that multiply to get a positive. So either it has to be positive times positive or negative times negative. But when you add them up, they're also going to be positive. So it can't be two negatives, right?
Right.
Okay, good. So we need two numbers that are positive, and they multiply to be 6, and they add to be 5. Any ideas?
2 and 3.
2 and 3, right? So did you have to make this whole table to be able to figure that out?
No.
Right. Okay, so good. Once you get used to this, you can see that x plus 3 and x plus 2 is your answer. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's try one more that's maybe a little bit more difficult here. X squared minus 7x plus 10. So first, is it going to be x minus and x minus, x plus and x plus, or 1 plus and 1 minus? What's it going to be?
1 plus and 1 minus.
Well, if it were 1 plus and 1 minus, then we would have a negative here, right?
Oh, yeah.
So what do you think it's going to be?
2 negatives.
2 negatives, good. And so we know that a negative times a negative will be a positive, and we know that they had to add together to be negatives. So it has to be 2 negatives. It can't be 2 positives, okay? So we're going to have 2 negatives, and we need 2 negative numbers that multiply to get to be 10 and add up to be negative 7. So any ideas there?
Negative 2 and negative 5.
Good. So you just knew the factors of 10, and you could write that out. And we could see that minus 5x and minus 2x will be that negative 7x, and a minus 5 times a minus 2 is 10. Mm-hmm. Make sense?
Yeah. Okay,
good. So now let's look at just a couple of special cases over here. The first one is called the difference of squares. You probably have seen this before. But here, instead of, we just have a very special pattern, which is x minus a number times x plus a number. And you could switch these two. It could be x plus 4 times x minus 4. And I should say the quantity x plus 4 times the quantity x minus 4. We put our same arrows in there. And what's going to happen is you're going to come up with x times x, and then finish this for me.
Oh. X times positive 4.
Good, plus x times 4.
Yeah, minus x times 4.
Minus 4 times x, yeah. Good, and?
And minus 4 times 4.
Minus 4 times 4, okay, good. So let's keep writing this out once we simplify that.
X squared plus 4x.
Good.
Minus 4x.
Good.
Minus 16.
Good. Now we're going to go ahead and combine like terms, just like we did way over here. but something special is going to happen. What's 4x minus 4x?
0.
So that term's just going to drop out. So we have x squared minus 16. So the really interesting thing is when you see something like this, you might think, oh gosh, how do I even factor that? Because I don't have this middle term. But what you have is a difference of squares. And when you see that difference of squares, and what I mean is a difference of perfect squares, because 16 is a perfect square and so is x squared, then you know you can just go to this pattern here and go ahead and just factor it right up to that. Kind of like you were able to factor these really easily just in your head. Once you get used to this pattern, you can do it. Okay, and then just one other example. Let's try another example of a difference of squares here. So if you have x squared minus 49, you kind of think, that looks familiar. It looks like this pattern here. What was this one going to end up being?
-7 and +7.
Good. So if we were to write it out, we would write the quantity x minus 7 times the quantity x plus 7. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, now one other special case. What if you have an extra factor? So here, this one looks pretty complicated because you have a 2x squared minus 14x plus 20. You start thinking, oh gosh, I don't know how to do that because I know how to do x times x. But here I have a 2x squared. But do you see that there's any factor that's common to all three of these?
Yeah.
What is it?
The +2.
Positive 2. So we could factor 2 out of that, and we could come up with 2, and then we have x squared, and then instead of minus 14, we factor the 2 out, so we have minus 7x. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then instead of plus 20, we have plus 10. So you can see that these two things are equivalent. And then look at this is x squared minus 7x plus 10. It's just this one over here. It was just disguised. So we know that that's going to factor to this right here. So we can go ahead and write. And this would be our answer with just that 2 hanging out there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Great. So now you know how to factor trinomial into two binomials, or a difference of squares, or some factor that you bring outside, and then you have your binomial. Good job.